So, when many of you saw maybe the poster for the presentation or got an email and saw that my presentation was going to be on the Civil War, you probably had some sort of immediate reaction or opinion. You might have been excited or intrigued or nostalgic. It's a topic you're interested in or grew up enjoying. You might have also felt a sense of dread. It's something that usually when it comes up in our contemporary age, it's not in a good context and it's usually very political. You probably also tried to guess my opinion and what I would be talking about to figure out ahead of time if you were going to like it. Especially when you saw the specific topic I was going to be looking at. Everyone has a preconceived notion about the American Civil War, and no one who has at least some interest in politics or culture or history is indifferent to it. So, why are Americans so obsessed with the Civil War? Is it the current political moment and climate we're in? Well, obsession with war is nothing new. It's been something that has captivated our national imagination for almost 150 years. Professor Zimmerman likes to point out that the South tends to care a lot more about the war, primarily because it's in their face all the time. There are battlefields everywhere you go. There are places of interest, there's monuments. So they are constantly being reminded of it in a way that the North usually isn't, with the exception of central Pennsylvania, as I always follow up by reminding him. But it's the same reason that Americans don't think about the World War I as much, because we don't have World War I battlefields here. They're all overseas. So this is Dr. Alan Gelzo. He's actually a graduate of Cam University. He's the head of the history department at Princeton and a very highly regarded Civil War historian. He once said that about the Civil War, that for one thing, it's exciting. It's a great conflict. It's our national Iliad and Odyssey. We have contest, we have conflict, we have drama. The Civil War presents us on it speaks to us on a number of levels, and it presents us with a drama that we just can't resist. And the more I thought about it, the more apt his comparison to the Iliad came to me. And I just kind of went down this train of thought, all the similarities between the two. You have these larger than life figures, you have the difference between the true believers and these reluctant heroes. It's this epic struggle, you have an invasion, you have these people defending their homes. There's a what if aspect to it. There's the arguments of what if Hector doesn't lose his duel, or what if Stonewall Jackson survives Chancellorsville. There's the War of Kings, but there's also the War of Soldiers, to steal a quote from the movie Troy. It's old men talking and young men dying. There's also these historical grudges that had fermented for a long time before the war that are then being played out, and lasting ramifications because of that. You have these glorified figures, but you also have these complicated anti-heroes. And the ending itself is very complicated and messy and has consequences going forward. And even today, there's a common debate of the good guys. And that's where I had to stop myself before I went completely down this rabbit trail and my paper turned into something else entirely. But that may be why so many of us are captivated by the story of the war. But most of us are primarily going to be influenced by how we were taught growing up. So how is the Civil War taught? Well, there's this method of teaching this. This is what your lower grade school is probably going to be like. Very clean, it's very simplified. It's the North and the South, and the North wore blue and the South wore gray, and the country split in half, and then we fought, and then we came back together. The end. Point of order, I hate this picture so much. Why are they so close together? Why are they all wearing the same thing? Why are they all wearing winter coats or something? Oh, how did you get there? So there's the other way of teaching it, which is what a lot of us might call great man theory, where you take these larger than life figures and you go over their biographies and their speeches and their opinions about the war, and you just kind of pick your guy, and then the war is more of a backdrop for these people's stories. There's also this way of learning about it, This is never taught in school. This is the really nerdy way of learning about it. There are a lot of professional historians who do not go this deep. But what most people end up taking away is something along these lines. There's some sort of hero or story that they latch onto that then determines how the rest of the war is going to be interpreted. But then what happens when the story changes or your hero isn't the person you made them out to be originally? That's how we get this. What happens when these men are not truly on the pedestals that we once placed them on? What happens when the story no longer fits with our modern sensibilities or our moral priorities? This is a side effect of something we call presentism, which is judging the past through the lens of the present. And it often leads to iconoclasm. And something about iconoclasm is that you often end up regretting it later down the line, even if it feels really good and really right in the moment. But Jason, you're forgetting something, says anybody who knows what my paper is about. And you're right. Forgot this part of the story. Forgot these guys, because when we get caught up in all the other stuff, we forget these guys. This sort of study is often referred to as the people's history or social history or history from below. It gained popularity in the second half of the 1900s. It's especially during the Vietnam era, and it's often seen from a Marxist point of view, but it is nothing new with the study of the Civil War. For many people, though, once they get out of the classroom, their first foray into the study is going to be something along these lines: your movies, books, historical fiction, or it might be reenactments and living history. And both the fiction side and the living history side tend to center around the history from below, the everyman, the experiences of the soldiers and the civilians. It doesn't focus on the political narrative as much as it focuses on what it was like. So this view of the Civil War is really a relic of the bygone era. I realized when I was making this slide that with one exception, all of these pieces of media are older than I am. Which I did not realize that about Magic Treehouse, and that's very sobering. I know. But this used to be how the average American viewed the Civil War. There's Billy Yank and Johnny Reb, and they're kind of these caricatures who are different in specific ways, but similar in a lot of ways. And they're all Americans, and they're all fighting for something, but not the same thing. But then they make up at the end. But again, it's turned into this. The narrative of the American Civil War is turned into this side was wrong and evil, and this side was right, and even they were still pretty bad. Quick reminder, in case you forgot, this is the title of my presentation. So what does popular perception and discourse have to do with enlisted men and their motivations? Well, in the modern climate, we seem to have forgotten the common soldier of the Civil War. And as I said, the discourse has become Lincoln in the North were good and righteous, Lee in the South were evil and racist, or worse, in my opinion. Lee in the South were evil and racist. Frederick Douglass was actually the only person who was right. And Lincoln in the South were also racist and just did everything for political gain. So while we were so busy doing this, again, we completely forgot about them. Forgot about what they fought, why they fought, how they viewed the enemy, and how they viewed themselves. We spent so much time talking about America's sins, debating who is right and who is wrong, that we've ignored the actual Americans who experienced this bloody and traumatic time in our history. So Gelzo, in an interview, addressed this. He said that so often in the Civil War, what we encounter are amateurs. The Civil War is fought by civilians in uniform on short-term enlistments. It's fought by people who don't have any sort of professional training, who have to pick this up on the fly. That's why we latch on to these stories. America likes to view its history as a story, and specifically as a hero's journey. We like to picture ourselves as the underdog or the amateur or the unexpected hero who rises up and takes on the mighty British Empire. And that's why we love Billy Yank and Johnny Reb. It's because they're examples of the everyman who went to fight for his home and what he believes is right. It's the same way we tell the story about the Revolutionary War or World War II. And in order to understand the war and its lasting effects on society, we need to understand not only what the average soldier went through, but that their experiences and motivations can't be shoved into neat little boxes. So before we get too deep into it, I need to make a few clarifications on what this paper is not. This paper is not an argument for or against the removal of statues. This is not a defense or critique of the lost cause narrative or really any other narrative. It's not a defense or critique of Abraham Lincoln, Jefferson Davis, Ulysses Grant, Robert E. Lee, or any other major historical figures. And it's also not a debate over why the Southern states seceded. Yeah. I begin my paper by saying that the greatest disservice done to the past is simplification. We have this bad habit of wanting to shove everything into the lowest common denominator so we can talk about it as simply and as quickly as possible and then move on to the next thing. And because of this, we mythologize, we vilify, and we stand in judgment over history to the point that we forget the humanity of our ancestors. As historians, we have a bird's eye view of history. We can see what went into something, but we can also see the long-lasting ramifications and we can see the whole picture. But those who lived through these events did not have that luxury. They made decisions with the information they had at the time and place they were in. And we cannot know what we would have done if we found ourselves in the same shoes. So 2 years ago, I began this paper, and it has changed significantly since then. My original intention was that I was going to solve the debates of states' rights versus slavery and union versus abolition by looking at the enlisted soldiers' counts. And so 2 semesters into college, I set out with the confidence of a 20-year-old to prove that the average Civil War soldier's views on the issues of the Civil War are primarily and reliably based on his geographic origin and economic status. Basically, I wanted to make a cohesive system where if you told me where a soldier was from, what he did in life, I could tell you who he fought for, why he fought, maybe who he voted for, and his opinions on the other side and everything else involved. So several difficulties that I ran into. The first one was that I limited myself to enlisted men. This I did on purpose, and I knew it was going to make things more difficult for me, because first of all, I was just narrowing my pool, if you will. And also, enlisted men are much less likely to be educated, so they were less likely to be writing during the process. And speaking of writing, I wanted to focus on letters and journals instead of memoirs because they are more reliable. Memoirs provide their own challenges. First, they're primarily written by educated veterans, often from the upper class, who possessed the time and skill to author entire books about their experiences. Secondly, the recollective nature of memoirs allowed the writers to edit the accounts in certain ways. High-profile officers often portrayed their actions in the best possible light. In the decade after the war, veterans may have also been tempted to whitewash their political and practical motivations. As such, the memoirs that are relevant to the study may not be fully reliable representations of the soldier's beliefs. In the same way that a former Confederate soldier may have downplayed his beliefs regarding slavery, a Northern veteran might have retroactively declared that he had always fought for the abolition of slavery and had always been a staunch abolitionist. One example of this that I found was the Society of the Army of the Tennessee, which was a Union veteran organization that claimed in its charter that the Union soldier had, quote, fought every battle from firing upon the Union flag at Fort Sumter to the surrender of Lee Appomattox in the cause of human liberty, burying treason and slavery in the potter's field of nations and making all our citizens equal before the law. In short, the longer a story is told, the actions become grander and the causes become nobler, just as individuals like Chamberlain may have been tempted to exaggerate their role, so are many individuals tempted to portray their own motivations as wholly pure and just. Letters and journals also didn't always have the information that I wanted. A lot of the issues that I'm trying to talk about, these soldiers would have taken for granted. If you're writing a letter home to your wife after you've enlisted, you're not going to explain to her why you enlisted, because assumingly you had that conversation over the dinner table. So most of these letters, journals are going to focus more on their everyday experiences, what's happening, what life is like. And then finally, I realized that I was just trying to put people in boxes, which was exactly what I was complaining about going into this. And even if I was making a few more boxes to put them in, they were still boxes nonetheless. So going into what I did find, in order to understand the events of the Civil War, like most things, you have to actually delve deep into what led up to it, and specifically the culture of the United States. I say culture of the United States, but that's not exactly accurate. As any American can tell you, America is not a culture. We have many different cultures. And all of those cultures have different histories and origins. To understand the backgrounds of the soldiers, you need to understand the histories of their backgrounds, if you will. Of course, as a historian, I think the best way to understand something is to just look at its history. So the major resource I used was the book American Nations by Colin Woodard. His thesis is essentially that America is not one or two or three different cultures. America isn't even a nation if we're thinking of nations as people groups. America is a collection of people groups that all come from different histories and are not bound by state or national borders. And these nations and their territories, if you will, shift over time. Yeah, so a quote from his book is that the Civil War era has long been portrayed as a struggle between the North and the South, two regions that culturally and politically did not actually exist. Historians have danced around the problem, offering a variety of terms to try to support the flawed paradigm. Border South, Middle South, Upper South, Lower South, Cotton South, Border North, or Upper North. They've agonized over the deep internal divisions in Maryland and Missouri, Tennessee and Louisiana, Indiana, Virginia, and Texas. They've argued over whether or not the war was fought for slavery or whether it was a struggle between the Celts and their Anglo and Teutonic rivals. Any state-by-state analysis inevitably produces results that are confusing and unsatisfactory. So this is the map that he provides of the American nations. The ones we are going to be concerning ourselves with are Yankeedom, the Midlands, Tidewater, Greater Appalachia, and the Deep South. Technically, New France, Spanish Caribbean, and New Netherlands are all involved in the Civil War. I will not be discussing New France and the Spanish Caribbean. I'll be briefly touching New Netherlands. So we're going to bring in with Yankeedom because we're not doing things in chronological order. Yankeedom was founded in 1620 with the Mayflower and the Pilgrims, the first Thanksgiving, and we've all heard that story plenty of times about how they all came across from England in search of religious freedom to create this new world where everyone would be able to have rights and live how they wanted to live and worship how they wanted to worship. Except that's not true because the Puritans didn't actually want religious freedom. They just wanted to be the religious group that was in charge, and then they could tell everyone else what to do. Woodard describes their goal as an applied religious utopia. And this is evident in the City on a Hill speech that was that many of you probably read in high school, that they wanted New England to be an example to the rest of the world of how to create a Christian society. And they were very influenced by John Calvin and Geneva. Geneva or John? Geneva, yeah. So obviously, New England has a pretty cold climate, which means less agriculture, which means in the long run, once we get into the other aspects of the Civil War, they also just have less need of slaves. They abolished slavery very quickly in the late 1700s, around the American founding, kind of one state at a time. But they would actually lose a lot of their political power in 1800 after John Adams lost re-election to Thomas Jefferson. This was not specifically the thing that took away their political power. It was what they did during the Jefferson and the Madison administrations. Specifically, during the War of 1812, they were very much against the war. They tended to side with Napoleon over England, and then we all know what happened with Napoleon. They were also very opposed to the Louisiana Purchase, which is usually hailed today as one of the best decisions in American history. One of the main reasons they didn't like it was because it meant we would acquire New Orleans. While many people saw that as a great thing, New Orleans was a very wealthy city and a very good port city, it's also Catholic. And these Puritans did not want a bunch of Catholics to now be represented in Congress. They also saw that a lot of these states that would come out of this acquisition would be southern states. A lot of the territories that were being settled during this time were very northern territories, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. But they saw all of that new territory that would be acquired, like it once did. Moving on to the Midlands. Midlands began with William Penn in 1681, right here in the great city of Philadelphia. And unlike Yankeedom, it was actually founded for religious freedom. It was founded to be a haven for all of these fringe denominations that were being persecuted by the Anglicans in England or the Puritans in New England. So your Quakers, your Amish, your Mennonites, maybe some Baptists in there, all came to Pennsylvania seeking tolerance. Pennsylvanians and what would become the Midlands culture was known for being very self-sufficient and very industrious. They were small farmers. They liked doing things on their own. They didn't hate government, but they saw government as an inconvenience. And like I said, very industrious, very inventive, very capitalistic. Think Benjamin Franklin. And eventually they're going to move westward with the pioneers and their Conestoga wagons, seeking new lands to farm. As I said, the Quakers were the first big group. You have your Amish, your Mennonites, all of those are notably pacifist groups. But then a lot of German immigrants would also settle in Pennsylvania. And the society was largely ruled by the Golden Rule. It was, I will do what I want to do, you will do what you want to do, we will treat each other with respect, and we will generally leave each other alone. Moving on to Tidewater, like I said, we're not going in chronological order. It began with Jamestown in 1607, another story that we're mostly familiar with. They were not founded for idealistic reasons. They weren't really looking for gold. They were looking for opportunity, especially all of these younger sons of the English gentry who were not going to inherit anything. They didn't get any land, so they wanted to go get more land. So they quickly realized that the best way to make money in this region was tobacco plantations, which required a sustainable source of unskilled laborers, as tobacco is very labor intensive. It used to be a lot larger. This is the modern, what is considered Tidewater. It used to be the primary culture in North Carolina, in Virginia, in Maryland, and shrunk over time. It was also a leading voice in the American founding, George Washington, Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson. And not finally, and ultimately, the Deep South began with the Carolina colony, used to be one colony, in 1670. They were relocated Caribbean planters, largely, who were coming to look for new lands to farm sugar, as it had been very successful in the Caribbean, and that's a lot more land than the Caribbean. Ultimately, they found that cotton was equally profitable, and they eventually overtook Tidewater in what Woodard refers to as the Dixie Coalition, which is what you would simplify to just say the American South. And finally, we have Greater Appalachia. This was the last of the region we'll be talking about to be founded. It doesn't have a specific founding date. It was more just multiple waves of settlers, and it was largely Scotch-Irish. These people from northern England, the Scottish lowlands, northern Ireland, who not like the English gentry. They were tired of being used and abused in their wars. They're a very warlike culture. They're a very honor-based culture. And they come here to be left alone. As I said, they emphasize honor and liberty, and personal individualism. And it's a very mountainous region that was unsuitable for the plantation-style agriculture of Tidewater and the South. It was also the birthplace of the Whiskey Rebellion. Even though the Whiskey Rebellion happened in Pennsylvania, it's the Appalachian regions of Pennsylvania. In case you are not familiar, Alexander Hamilton, during Washington's presidency, was looking for something that they could tax that would give a good amount of revenue to the federal government. They landed on whiskey. But the thing is that the Greater Appalachia used whiskey basically as a currency. They didn't have a lot of hard cash on hand. They didn't have a lot of gold. But whiskey, it has a very long shelf life. It's inherently valuable, and it takes a long time to make. You can't just pop up a new batch of whiskey. There's the distilling process. So they were not happy that the federal government was taxing one of their primary exports and resources. And also, since they were spread out across multiple states and multiple rural regions of states, they didn't have a lot of political power. They couldn't do anything about it. So they kind of decided to secede. Of course, this failed. when George Washington decided to come to personally put down the rebellion, and no good American wanted to shoot a musket at George Washington. So fast forward to 1860. This is the election of 1860. This was the last election, arguably, before we have the modern two-party system. As you can see, there are 4 different parties that won electoral votes. Throughout from the 1790s to the 1860s, you just have this long string of different political parties that kept shifting and splitting and renaming themselves, from your Federalists and your Anti-Federalists, your Democratic Republicans, your many different flavors of Democrat, your Whigs, the American Party, also known as the Know Nothing Party, the Republican Party, and brand new for this election was the Constitutional Union Party. So we'll go pretty fast through this for time's sake, but obviously you have Abraham Lincoln. He was the Republican nominee. He gave no speeches during the campaign. He was basically just the figurehead of the Republican Party, which did not earn him many favors in the South, who already didn't like the Republican Party, and they had no reason to see to like Lincoln. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know he had leadership abilities. He was just chosen because he was this blue-collar guy. He was a rail splitter. He was an honest aide, and he was very palatable to the Northern public, so they just kind of put him at the front of their ticket. He was also only the Republican Party's second ever presidential candidate. He was elected. He was elected by every northern state, asterisk, New Jersey split for him and Stephen Douglas, and only the northern states. Again, the South did not like this. They all voted for someone other than Lincoln, and yet Lincoln is becoming president. Next, we have Stephen Douglas, who is usually cast as like Lincoln's primary rival and the primary foil to Lincoln, even though he's technically the most similar to him, as they're both Northerners. They're both from Illinois, which is why they had so many debates, because they kept running for the same offices. He believed in popular sovereignty. The individual states should decide for themselves on the issue of slavery, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and he only won Missouri as an entire state. Next, John C. Breckinridge. So he was the Southern Democrat candidate. After the Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas, all of the Southern delegates said, no, we don't like this guy either. They walked out. They said they were doing their own thing, and they nominated John C. Breckinridge. He publicly said that he believed in the state's right to secede, but that he wasn't necessarily arguing for secession. He was not saying, and he made sure that everyone knew, he was not saying, if I don't win this election, you should leave the Union. Nevertheless, after he lost the election, he's like, I should leave the Union. And then he served as a major general in Feder's army. And finally, there's John Bell. He was from the Constitutional Union Party. They were a single policy or single platform party. They were saying states' rights issues, slavery issues, who cares? The Union is the most important thing. We can deal with our issues, but we need to stay together. John Bell actually won Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia. And he argued that secession wasn't necessary because all of the things they wanted were already protected in the Constitution, and the Constitution wasn't going anywhere. But then after the election, after the first wave of states seceded, he actually went to his home state of Tennessee and argued in favor of secession, which lost him a lot of friends. So because of how split the country was just along party lines, it's no surprise that secession was also not a clear-cut issue. I apologize for the low quality image. It was the only one I could find that actually had all of the information that I was looking for, which is kind of part of the problem of this paper. You probably saw something like this in your textbook growing up, but probably moved on pretty quickly, and the general gist was just they didn't all secede at once. But it's actually really important that they didn't all secede at once and that they had different reasons for seceding. The gray states, your upper South, and the border states of the blue South, they all went through democratic processes to decide whether to secede after the election, and all of them voted no, that they wanted to wait and see what would happen and stay in the Union. So a London Times correspondent, after South Carolina seceded, reported back to his newspaper, secession is the fashion here. Young ladies sing for it, old ladies pray for it, young men are dying to fight for it, and old men are ready to demonstrate it. And fashion is the right word for it. It was literally the fashion, because political merchandise is nothing new. These are called cockades. They were badges that actually date back to the American Revolution, They used them in the French Revolution, and they're just used to express different political opinions, and different variations mean different things. The red, white, and blue was usually used for the Union, and other variations, whether that be solid colors or maybe a red with white but no blue, usually meant secession. I'm wearing one currently. But nevertheless, besides the uproar in the culture and all the political discourse around it, no new states would secede between February 1st, when Texas had seceded, and April 17th. So some of the reasons that the Upper South wanted to stay in the Union, they held the Union in a much higher regard than the Deep South. They viewed it as this active good that needed to be protected, not just something to be left when it was convenient or expeditious. They also had stronger economic ties to the North. They were more industrialized. They were closer to it. They also, their proximity to it meant that they were more likely to have family on the other side of the border or other sorts of social ties. Also had a lower percentage of slaves than the Deep South because of they were more industrialized regions and the mountainous regions as well. They believed the Constitution protected slavery and states' rights and all the other things they believed in. They believed were enshrined in the Constitution. And like I said, the Constitution wasn't going anywhere. So they held out for a peaceful resolution. And then this happened. This is, of course, Fort Sumter. South Carolina artillery would fire on Fort Sumter on April 12th of 1861. They then surrendered on April 13th. No casualties were happened during the battle, but 2 men were mortally wounded during the surrender ceremony when a caisson exploded. The Union soldiers were all returned home unmolested, but this galvanized the North. It was the kind of battle that neither side wanted to be blamed for. They both said that the other side was the aggressor. But the North really saw the South as the aggressor. Before this, only Yankeedom supported using force to bring the Confederate States back into the Union. But after Fort Sumter, the majority of Northerners were on board with this, including Lincoln. That's why he called on April 15th for 75,000 volunteers to quell the rebellion. Each state was given a quota based on their population, and this caused outrage in the Upper South. It was viewed as a betrayal by Lincoln, who had promised peace, promised that he was going to go through every means he could to save the Union, and now he had gone back on his word in the eyes of the Southerners. Now that war was inevitable, these states would have to decide which side they were going to fight for, because they couldn't just sit by because they were in the middle. They would literally be the battlefields that it was fought on. And because of that, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee would secede within a month. So first of these, we're going to talk about Virginia. Their love of the Union was very much fueled by their history with the Founding Fathers. As I said earlier, George Washington, Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Edmund Randolph, all of these great figures of the American founding came from Virginia. They also, kind of on the other side of the argument, have the history of the sic semper tyrannis, thus always the tyrants. They hate overbearing government, unless it's them. So to many of them, Lincoln had just replaced King George as the tyrant that needed to be overthrown. Virginia was also very important to the North because both sides saw it as a sign of legitimacy for their government. Lincoln even considered exchanging Fort Sumter to the South in exchange for a signed agreement saying Virginia will not secede. And is quoted as saying, "A state for a fort is no bad business," which he's not wrong. So much of the early volunteers, while we're talking about Virginia, came from pre-existing militia units. America has a long history of militias. You have your Minutemen in Lexington and Concord, but there's also the frontiersmen, your Daniel Boone and David Crockett, fighting Indian raids in the wild. And then, especially after the Nat Turner Rebellion and John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, a lot of Southerners realized that the danger of sudden violence was much more real, so they started preparing. And these militia units could range from like the young elites of an urban area who almost use this as a social club. That's actually what both of these pictured regiments, 1st Virginia and I think the 7th New York, was just these rich social clubs, essentially, but with guns and uniforms, which sounds fun. But you would also have other areas where their militia was just the shopkeepers and farmers coming in every month with their rifles to do some drills and to get ready. Actually, the militiamen and the volunteers of the early war are one of the reasons Dr. Delzo argues that both armies wanted to fight a defensive war, because it's very difficult to go on the offensive or do an invasion when your military is not a regular army and your communication isn't as smooth, you're not as disciplined. So the militias became very relevant. Battle of Philippi, which was June 3rd, 1861. It's the first land engagement of the war. It's when General George McClellan led Union troops that were made up of Pennsylvanians, Highlands, and Western Virginians who were loyal to the Union. They marched on the town of Philippi, which was a Confederate town, fired a couple volleys, so there were very few casualties, and the Confederate militia ran away to the point where the Union soldiers referred to it as the races at Philippi. But to the Southerners, despite this being a loss, this invoked images of the Minutemen, of Lexington Green, of the shot heard round the world. So Nelson Langford, in his book Cry Havoc, which is about the secession crisis, talks about how it was easier for people in the Deep South and in the free states to rally around their respective causes. It took longer for the Upper South to torn internally in different directions to reach that point. But once the time came to choose, many of the wavering Unionists there made the decision for the South. For them, it was motivated not so much by support of the Confederacy, but by defense of their local communities against the perception that Lincoln meant them harm. Unlike secessionist radicals, they made the atavistic decision for families and friends, not for abstract constitutional principles of states' rights or defense of slavery. So one of the questions that's often brought up when talking about the Civil War is, why did poor Southerners side with the rich planters, slave owners in this war? And there's many different theories that have been put forward. The first point to make is that abolition was not popular nationwide. It's still a minority opinion in the North, even. But Aaron Sheehan Deed, he wrote a book called Why Confederates Fought, and his argument, what I'll call the social hierarchy view, which is that Virginia yeomen, or like your poor farmers and landowners, had only actually achieved full rights in 1850. So, which put them on, if you envision society as a pyramid, put them one rung above the slaves. They thought that if abolition came to be, it would just push them back down to the bottom rung. And a lot of them thought that this was actually on purpose, that the rich Yankees up in the North, those darn New Englanders, wanted to push them back down, and that they were specifically targeting these rights that they had fought so hard for. There's also the suggestion that slavery was just such an integral part of the economy that the economy is supposed to benefit everyone in the society. You don't want it to tank. Maybe they hoped to afford slaves in the future. Also, Frank Owsley makes the point that our thoughts of class and how the rich and poor interact are very much, whether consciously or not, affected by Marx. Marx wasn't a thing yet. They did not have this idea of the rich being their oppressors. They just saw them as my neighbor who has more money than me. And finally, as we discussed earlier, there's just the immediate threat of an invasion that they're going to be more reactionary towards. But not all Southerners are going to respond so strongly to invasion. You've heard me refer to Western Virginia, not West Virginia. Western Virginia was not part of Tidewater. It was Greater Appalachia. They had very few slaves, mountainous region. They were much poorer than Tidewater. And while they hated the Tidewater aristocrats and they hated the Yankees, they hated the aristocrats a little bit more. So when McClellan first marches into the region, all of the Union sympathizers in the area were very helpful and allowed him to conquer the area very quickly. So in June of 1863, they declared that Western Virginia was now West Virginia. It was its own state. As you can see by this map over here, this is the border. These are the counties that voted to secede. Not all counties were on board with staying in the Union. Part of the reason that this is going to not come out in the later votes is that many of the Southern sympathizers in the region left to go fight, so they're not there to vote in a Union-occupied territory. All of these different factors and controversies lead to Henry Wise, who was the governor of Virginia before the war, referring to West Virginia as, quote, the bastard child of political rape, unquote. He did not mince words about the issue. And it raises an interesting question. if a state is allowed to leave another state, why is a state not allowed to leave the Union? But going back to the topic of invasion, let's discuss the great state of Tennessee. They originally voted against not just secession, but a convention for secession. They didn't even want to have a committee discuss it originally. But then after Lincoln called for volunteers, they said, let's bypass the convention. They just did a popular vote, and the vote swung completely the other direction. There was higher voter turnout. The Tennessean people had spoken. They wanted to leave the Union. Part of the understanding of Tennessee is that it is split into three grand divisions. You have Eastern, Middle, and Western Tennessee. Eastern Tennessee is very similar to Kentucky and West Virginia. Western Tennessee is more Mississippi, and Middle Tennessee is, well, the middle. So there were a lot more Unionist sympathizers in Eastern Tennessee. However, they never split like West Virginia did. So in his survey of Confederate soldiers, historian Kenneth Noe observes that, quote, a scant few wrote of invasion without simultaneously damning the invader, unquote. Ideology will always submit itself to the two strongest human emotions, love, hatred. For the men of the Upper South, the love of home and family soon resulted in hatred for the same enemy that was threatening them. Although many Tennesseans scorned both Yankee intervention and Tidewater elitism, only one of those groups was sending an army to invade Nashville. But on the other side of that issue, you have Kentucky. It declared itself neutral during the secession crisis. It said, we're just staying out of this. We're not giving troops to either side. You guys fight this out. Governor McGuffins declared that Kentucky will furnish no troops for the wicked purposes of subduing her southern sister states and will maintain her present independent position, taking sides not with the government, not with the seceding states, but with the Union against them both. However, many Kentuckians did not feel this way initially. Many went to fight for the Union. That was a flag that was used by one group of Kentucky Unionists. And quite a few of them also would go south to fight for the Army of Tennessee and the Confederacy. That was actually the flag that what was called the Orphan Brigade used. They were the Orphan Brigade because their mother state was not with them. However, in 1862, Braxton Bragg and the Army of Mississippi invaded Kentucky. They believed that Kentucky was basically being held in the Union by force. They would be a liberating army and it would take its place among the Confederacy. However, it had the opposite effect. The Kentuckians instead saw the Confederates as the invaders, and it drove them further towards the Union. General William Sherman is quoted saying in Kentucky that the young men were generally secessionists and had joined the Confederates, while the Union men, the aged and the conservatives, not enroll themselves to engage in conflict with the relations on the other side. Moving on to Maryland, which is even more controversial than any other state being discussed. They were a heavily divided state. They literally broke their flag in two for the purposes of this war. Most of this partisanship and intrigue was focused around the city of Baltimore, where political gangs were very powerful, and each party just had their gang that did their dirty work, if you will. General Lee would invade in September of 1862, hoping again to free the state from what he saw as occupation. He gave his men strict rules not to anger the public, and yet it was still unsuccessful, partially because they lost the battle, which definitely didn't help. But again, a lot of the Southern sympathizers had already left the state at that point. So some of the controversies surrounding the state, a group in Baltimore tried to assassinate Lincoln before his inauguration. Again, they were invaded at one point, which did not sway the state towards secession. But also, the federal government started jailing secessionist politicians and newspapers, suspended habeas corpus, trampled the First Amendment. They would jail people for showing Confederate imagery, which, along with the enlistment, also just drove a lot of Confederate sympathizers to leave the state in general. There was also a heavy military presence, so if they tried to leave, they wouldn't get very far. Next, we're going to talk about Delaware. There's not much to talk about Delaware. I put this in here to make Professor Zimmerman happy. So they were the smallest of the southern states. They had the smallest slave population, less than 2%, and then compared to a 9% population of free African Americans, not citizens. Yeah. The international slave trade was outlawed from the state in 1776, before the British Empire outlawed it. And then they expanded that ban in 1852 to apply to interstate trade as well. So the institution was absolutely dying in the state. They provided 12,000 soldiers to the Union and negligible to the Confederacy, especially for a southern state. There were no Confederate Delaware regiments because they did not have the roughly 1,000 men that were required. Only important thing that happened there was that Fort Delaware was used as a POW camp.
Thank you.
So Missouri was actually very intertwined with the sectional issues of North and South since the 1820s, since the Missouri Compromise, since it became a state. They rejected the secession in March of 1861, but Unionist and secessionist groups did form opposing militias in different areas. The large German population was the primary group of Unionists in the state. Both governors that they had through the war were at odds with Lincoln. The first one wanted Lincoln to stay out entirely. The other just thought Lincoln was being generally unhelpful. And by the end of the war, they didn't have any like important military points of interest there. So no armies were really vying for control of Missouri. So these militias just started fighting each other in a guerrilla war. By the end of the war, they had stopped talking about politics altogether, and a lot of pre-existing feuds, family blood drama was just playing out with the war as an excuse to shoot each other. And finally, of the upper states, South states, we have North Carolina. It was the second last state to secede, but only after it was boxed in by other states. So what choice did they have? It's an interesting case because the rhetoric of the soldiers and the politicians are remarkably similar. Unlike in Virginia, where there was little agitation for secession before Lincoln's proclamation, North Carolina Unionists expected the North's hands-off attitude towards the Confederacy to lead to a gradual reunification. When this didn't happen, and Lincoln did the opposite of a hands-off attitude, sent troops in, they felt very betrayed, and all of their rhetoric is about betrayal and how much they hated Abraham Lincoln. In June of 1861, Private John Turner wrote, "It was with sorrow and regret that I left my business, but I felt I was not doing much good, and duty seemed to say, go fight for your country. And I pray that the good being will fill the Yankees' minds with something better than to attempt the subjugation of us innocent people." Another unknown soldier wrote home that it appears some of the good citizens of our adjoining county, Davidson, have not forgotten their once great love for the Union of all states and have taken to a special devotion to that prince of baboons, Abe Lincoln. However, the North Carolinian Unionists were too spread out. They were too far away from the Union to actually, get a foothold in the state. But the main thing I took away from my study of North Carolina was that they were the most reluctant to join the Confederacy, but once they were in, they were in. They sent North Carolina, Virginia, and Tennessee were the states that sent the most soldiers to fight for the Confederacy. So some of the common characteristics I found between the enlisted men in the upper South and border states on the Confederate side and the Union side. So Confederate soldiers in southern states, Union soldiers came from southern states. Both groups talked very little about slavery. It was all about rights and honor and the Union and betrayal, and it was much more emotional rhetoric. To the Confederate soldiers, the federal government was seen as deceitful, treacherous, while to the Union soldiers, the Confederates were traitors. The Union soldiers liked to reference the American founding, tradition, their ancestry, and the pride of the flag, while the Confederate soldiers referred to reference the Constitution or invasion or their southern sister states. The Confederate soldiers blamed the Deep South for the war and the abolitionists for making the Deep South mad. And the Unionists blamed the secessionists fire eaters for forcing war and making problems where there weren't problems. So finally, moving on to the North. I'm going to cover the North much less because it's less complicated. It's not that there's less to talk about, it's not that it's less interesting, it's that there's less to talk about. So even in the North, they were not united on political stances, not even within the Republican Party. So the way I kind of categorize the different Union political camps. You have your moderate abolitionists, your radical abolitionists, the Free Soilers, and the Northern Democrats. So starting with the moderate abolitionists, this was the official platform of the Republican Party, kind of the mainstream. So this is what Abraham Lincoln believed and John C. Freeman, his predecessor. They wanted gradual emancipation, kind of possibly monetary reimbursement. They wanted to use the rule of law to figure out the issue. They believed in the Constitution, they believed in our institutions, and they thought we can just utilize those the correct way. We can bring about the change we want to see. They didn't like the radicals because they thought they were giving the movement a bad reputation. And even though they really wanted abolition, the Union was more important. This was a very common opinion in Pennsylvania, in upstate New York, and the Great Lakes states. Next is the radical abolitionists. They believed in immediate and total abolition. They were open to the use of violence. John Brown, for example, they saw the Constitution and the legislative process as an obstacle to their agenda. David Lloyd Garrison, the man on the left there, once burned copies of the Constitution in protest, saying that it was a devil's bargain. And he actually argued that the northern states should secede so that they weren't associated with the South end. He viewed the South as evil entirely and irredeemable for practicing and allowing slavery. And they believed abolition, obviously, to be more important than Union if they were willing to leave it. And this was much more common in New England and Yankeedom, if you will. Next, we have the Free Soilers. They're not necessarily in favor of abolition, but they still disliked slavery because they thought it was anti-capitalist. They didn't like the competition. There were a lot of small farmers, and they didn't want it spreading west into territories. They aligned themselves a lot with the American Party, but also found some room in the Republicans and Democrats. And they believed that abolitionists were forcing the issue and forcing the country to be polarized, and forcing it down everyone's throats, as that political cartoon shows. This was much more common in the Midwest and the border states, Kentucky, Maryland, etc. And finally, the Northern Democrats were just against abolition in general, not because they liked slavery, they just thought it was good economically. They believed in popular sovereignty, as I said earlier, that states should decide for themselves, but they weren't necessarily saying that the northern states should re-legalize it. They viewed abolitionism as a threat to the Union, the American experiment, and many would eventually oppose the war and argue for appeasement, peace, even surrender at times. But how did that political division that a northern soldier might be coming from change over time? How did it affect how he looked at the war? So a couple of quotes that I picked out. Carl Schurz, who was a German Republican who had a lot of influence, said that men who until yesterday chided every Republican as a lowly abolitionist, called every abolitionist a traitor to the country, and loudly sworn to prevent any armed force to march through the city of New York, now hurried to arms to arm themselves. This is after Fort Sumter. James King, who was a soldier in the 11th Michigan Infantry, said that the bravery shown by our northern troops truly deserves praise and shows well their feelings in the noble cause in which they are engaged. And must be confessed, Confederates fought like men worthy of a better cause. We'll come back to that sentiment later. This is James King. He was probably my favorite read of all of the letters I read, because it was not only was he very well educated, he was very eloquent, easy to read. He also covered a long period of time, not just during the war, but after the war, and his family life and the economic endeavors after that. He was writing the letters to Jenny, who started the letters as his sweetheart and ended them as his wife. And after the war, he moved to Tennessee to start a farm, because while he was stationed there, he fell in love with the culture and the people and grew to respect them. So he wanted to move down there, and he talks in his letters about how he became part of the community and, again, really grew to appreciate Southern culture. So during the war, he wrote back that there is a party at home who sympathize with the traitors and are doing all in their power to clog the wheels of government and stop the prosecution of the war. They find fault with the proclamation of the president, that being the Emancipation Proclamation, and in every act of the administration. The Detroit Free Press says that the president had not issued the proclamation, proclamation, there would have been volunteers enough to fill all demand. Now, Jay, I do not think this issuing of the proclamation has made the difference of one man. Why don't they find fault with the Southern Confederacy, who have trampled all rights and liberties underfoot? Oh no, not a word to say. They are a much abused people, and the North was the aggressors. So this was a attitude by many soldiers that would come to light in the election of 1864. Even though we were at war, we are still a republic. We still need to decide who the next president will be. So Abraham Lincoln was, of course, running for re-election, but George McClellan, a former general who used to work for Lincoln until he was fired, decided to run against him. And McClellan was running on wanting a peace deal. He wanted to either make certain guarantees to the South so that they would come back into the Union, and if that didn't work, maybe even just end the war and allow them to leave. He hoped to gain support from the soldiers, first of all, because he had been very well loved as a general. He was very loath to send them into harm's way, and that made him popular. But he was specifically focusing on families of the soldiers who wanted to see their fathers and their sons and their brothers come home. However, soldiers did not agree. They actually wrote back to their families telling them to vote for Lincoln. They told them that the war was going great, that they believed in the cause, and that they thought they could win soon. Lincoln would end up receiving over 75% of the soldiers' votes. The only major voting bloc of soldiers that voted for McClellan were actually Kentuckians. But what about the politically apathetic? As with today, not everyone deeply cares or is involved in politics. There are many other societal factors that drive men to enlist, whether or not they believe in the cause. So a couple other motivations that I picked out. There were religious pressures, there was the idea of patriotic duty, the idea of gender roles, economic motivations, and conscription. So we'll start with religious pressures. So a quote that I took from John Kelso, who was a Missouri Unionist turned guerrilla fighter, very interesting character. He said of the beginning of the war, "From every pulpit was heard the equally heartless clang of the priest's voice, yelling to his God in blasphemous prayers, to help them dye the rivers with the beloved, and to enrich the soil with the unburied bodies of their brethren, his children." You will realize that John Kelso would not have been what we call the Christian. While the former priest was informing his God that he, the God, certainly should and certainly would destroy the Union and utterly overwhelm the abolitionist hordes of the North, the latter was just as distinctly informing him that he certainly should and certainly would preserve the Union and utterly overwhelm the pro-slavery rebel hosts of the South. What this God would have just done had the two parties been equal in strength, I do not know. As it was, he evidently helped the stronger party. So both sides used the pulpit as a way of spreading their political message. As you can see, not much has changed. There was this idea that if our cause is right and just, then God must be on our side. And if God is on our side in this war, then this war is a crusade. It's your duty as a Christian to fight in this crusade. Next, we have patriotic duty. This was not confined to the North. The idea that it was the male civilian in a country or citizen in a country whose duty it is to go and fight for that country. The Southerners saw the Confederacy as their country just as much because decades of political and cultural issues had polarized the region, so they kind of saw it as two different countries. Just like the Revolution, nationalism doesn't just go for pre-existing countries. You can be patriotic for a country that was founded a month ago. However, mentions of country were less common in the rebel writings. They were much more likely to reference home and what they were defending. Some examples are James King, as we mentioned earlier, saying, "We are here attempting to put down the vile miscreants who are aiming at the lifeblood of our beloved country." Private John Turner of North Carolina said, I already quoted that one. And finally, John Dooley, the 1st Virginia Volunteers, said, "Our presence at school any longer will be attended but with little good for us, for there is not one amongst us who is now able to devote that time, interest, and energy, requisite spirit, to the pursuit of our classes, while all we have most dear on earth, our country, our parents, and our brethren, call loudly upon our presence at our respective homes. Next, you have gender roles. The idea that it's the man's job to fight, to go provide, to protect. This is going to be a major part of most societies, especially during warfare. The women definitely helped with this motivation, as many women on both sides were reported as gifting different pieces of attire, ladies' attire, to men who refused to enlist, saying, "You're not going to fulfill your job as a man, very well, be a woman then." Kenneth Noe, in his survey called Reluctant Rebels, accounts that young gallants without sweethearts, wives, steeped in the novels of Sir Walter Scott and the wider culture of the Victorian era, ostensibly sought for fair ladies for whom to fight. As other scholars have also revealed, Southern white women at the beginning of the war publicly spurred men to enlist, leave home, and do their duty in a powerful example of initial motivation. Gerald Linderman went so far as to term women's demands that men enlist sexual intimidation. The notions of home and family life continually shaped federal soldiers' gendered language, values, and actions. They routinely saw themselves as boys becoming men in the ultimate coming-of-age ritual. Sons of the revolutionary fathers and mothers, they themselves would be revered as the fathers of the future nation once they disciplined their erring, weaker sister states and reunite the American family. Next, we have economic motivations. Pretty cut and dry. You don't have a paycheck, you don't have a good source of foods or a place to sleep. The Army offers all of those. This is especially tempting for immigrants who just got off the boat and are looking for a way to make a living in this new country. This led to some Southerners decrying many Yankees as mercenaries, almost like the Hessians in the Revolution. And then additional payment could also be gained by enlistment bounties or draft substitutions, which I'll explain later. And finally, conscription. The Civil War was the first war where the United States issued the draft. Actually, the Confederate States did it first in April of '62. They changed it a couple different times. The first change was what was called the 20 Negro Law, where they said if you are a Southern soldier or man eligible for the draft who owns 20 or more slaves, well, whatever enterprise you are doing must be more important to the war effort than you would be otherwise fighting. So they would allow them to return home. This was criticized by a lot of Confederates, both the draft and this act, as a violation of the very states' rights principles they were fighting for, because this was a tough-down decision by the Confederate government of Richmond. Ultimately, 15% of Confederate soldiers were conscripts and 9% were substitutions, where if someone was drafted and they really didn't want to go and they had a little bit of money, they would go find someone off the street and say, "I will pay you to take my place in the draft." As I said, the Union also issued a draft in March of 1863. The primary thing this led to was the New York draft riot. New York is not part of Yankeedom. New York is part of the Netherlands and was much less in favor of the war. They also had stronger ties to the Southern economy. They did not want to go to war with the South. They did not want to see the Southern economy crippled. In addition, New York, as it always has and continues to, has had a very large Irish population. And these Irish at that time were a very poor demographic and a very downtrodden demographic. And they were sitting here questioning, why am I being drafted to go fight for someone else's freedom when I am being oppressed right here? This led to a couple of Union soldiers being attacked during a protest, which led to a riot, which ultimately, sadly, devolved into a race riot as Irish protesters would attack African-American New Yorkers. As our last topic, as we start to close up, I'm going to go into a couple of unique cases that don't fit into the categories that I've discussed. The first is immigrants, which I've touched on a little bit. There was an influx of European immigrants after, known as the 48ers, after a series of revolutions and civil wars in Europe in 1848, in Germany, Ireland, Poland, and Hungary. A lot of refugees, a lot of soldiers on the wrong side of the war coming to America to make a new start. Many of these immigrants were either pure abolitionists or free soilers because they saw slavery as a leg up that other people had over them. And a lot of them were trying to prove their loyalty to their adopted country by fighting for it. They were strongly motivated as well to protect the Republican institutions of the United States that were the reason they came to this country out of some sort of monarchy. A couple quotes from immigrants during this time. A German newspaper from Washington said that they, the native born, do not understand free institutions because to them the difference between freedom and despotism is unknown. To us immigrants, it is reserved to save this land from destruction. As one paper argued, Irish immigrants had to defend the Union that made you its citizens, but most of all, the Constitution that has made you free. Furthermore, for Europeans, it was a significant difference to volunteer for an army protecting a democratic government instead of being drafted into an army serving a despotic monarch. In fact, Irish and German immigrants composed almost half of the enlisted troops in the American regular army before the war. And finally, Martin O'Feel, in the book True Sense of the Republic, notes that although eventually a great number of Irishmen would fight in the Northern armies, volunteers from the Green Isle provided the largest proportion of foreign-born troops in the Confederate forces as well. The Irish remained the only ethnic group to offer substantial support to both sides. Irish loyalty to the North or South is merely a question of locality. Next, we're going to discuss the United States Colored Troops, that was the official name of African-American regiments during the war. It's weird because there's not much to say about them because they were very clear-cut in what they believed and what they were fighting for. They were allowed to enlist following the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and they were initially just used in support roles, but ultimately they were allowed to fight. They had a 20% death rate, which was 35% higher than white regiments for multiple reasons. First, they were more likely to be sent into very dangerous scenarios. Second of all, if you're a Confederate soldier, there's a white regiment coming this way, a black regiment coming this way. You have to decide which way to point your rifle. Your decision might be swayed a little. Ultimately, 175 USCT regiments would be formed with 180,000 soldiers that were led by white officers because there were no African Americans graduating from West Point or VMI at that point because of other policies that were in place. But like I said, whether he had been free all his life or he had recently escaped from slavery, a African American would be much more willing to fight for abolition, for emancipation, than someone else because it was personal and because he may even be trying to free his family. Frederick Douglass, when they were first putting out the call for enlistment, wrote that there is no time to delay. The tide is at its flood that leads on to fortune. From east to west, from north to south, the sky is written all over, now or never. Liberty won by white men would lose half its luster. Who would be free themselves must strike the blow. Better even to die free than to live slaves. This is the sentiment of every brave colored man among us. There are weak and cowardly men in all nations. We have them amongst us. They tell you that this is the white man's war, that you will be no better off after than before the war, that the getting of you into the army is to sacrifice you on the first opportunity. Believe them not. Cowards themselves, they do not wish to have their cowardice shamed by your brave example. Leave them to their dignity, or to whatever motive may hold them back. I have not thought lightly of the words I am now addressing you. The counsel I give comes of close observation of the great struggle now in progress, and of the deep conviction that this is your hour and mine. Finally, we have American Indian soldiers. This was the group that surprised me the most when I was doing my initial resource because it was something I never thought about before. 5 native tribes officially joined the Confederacy. They had several reasons for doing so. First of all, they hated the federal government and had reasons too. So if you have to choose to fight for the federal government or for another group, you might not want to join with the presidency of Andrew Jackson and John Tyler. They also desired local sovereignty. They were on their reservation, and now that they were there, they wanted to be left alone and allowed to govern themselves. They also practiced slavery longer than Europeans had been on the continent. They would eventually adapt to the European system, but it was a much older tradition for these tribes. They also had a lot of cultural differences that make them interesting to study in comparison to a more European culture. Even more so than in Western society, American Indians saw warfare as the domain of men, participation in warfare as an intrinsic aspect of masculinity. Such warrior societies placed less emphasis on why a soldier went to war, what he fought for, instead viewing the going itself as a virtue. So the few accounts by Native American soldiers don't talk about politics. They talk about duty and the tribe and the glory of war almost. However, this was not all of these tribesmen wished to fight for the Confederacy. Many of them wished to remain neutral and stay out of the white man's war. So ultimately, the 8,000 Creek men tried to form a new camp to leave the primary reservation and just stay out of the conflict. However, the Confederate government saw them as a hostile force that was now camped in their territory and sent Choctaw regiments to conquer the fort that were eventually assisted by Texas regiments. However, those that escaped the attacks went to Kansas, said, I guess we're involved now, and came marching right back wearing blue uniforms. The man on the bottom is Valpoyalo, who was the man who led these Creek neutralists. And the man at the top is Brigadier General Stan Watie, who was a general in the Confederate Army and led many of the Cherokee and Choctaw regiments. So why is this all important? One of my main takeaways is that if you try to put everyone in boxes, you're going to run out of boxes. Post-war culture and the reaction to the American Civil War in the decades following has been criticized by many modern historians for whitewashing the war. The thing is that the priority of the nation was reconciliation. They were trying to come back together as one nation after 4 years of bloody conflict. They were trying to move forward into the new century as one country. However, not all Union veterans were in favor of reconciliation, but most have acquired a new admiration for the South during the war. The ground-up view of history was the norm during this time because the veterans were still alive and they could still tell their stories, so the nuances of the war were better understood. And if I could give you one word to take away from this, it is the word nuance. Contemporary culture tends to be very bipolar, not in a mental illness sort of way, but in a things are either this or they are that. They are either good or they are evil. You are on this side or you are on that side. Those alive at this time did not see things that way. And we can argue if the war was about this or that. And the answer is generally yes, all of it, because it depended on the person. And the war meant different things to different people. They understood that, and it allowed them to make peace. Thank you.